So great. Thanks for everyone for coming along. It's good to see you all. We've got a slightly different format today in that Geoffrey Whitby from DLUC has kindly come along to talk us through the consultation on the technical changes to the business rates for the new proposals around decoupling the multiplier, which is really useful. I know I've had quite a lot of conversations with people about that, so it'd be great to get Geoffrey's kind of view about what that means and what's happening. That's the first half hour. I think Geoffrey's going to do a 10-minute, 15-minute presentation. Then there's chance for questions immediately. So instead of the normal format of an hour's presentation, then half an hour's discussion, we'll do the questions for Geoffrey straight away. And Geoffrey's just going to talk about the consultation. So I don't want us to stray into wider things around what's going to be in the autumn statement or in the settlement. So we'll keep it just to that consultation. Just let you know, the webinar is being recorded. I'll have it edited and on the website first thing tomorrow morning. And with that, we'll move straight on to Geoffrey. So off you go, Geoffrey. Thank you.
Brill. Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So as Adrian said, I'm Geoffrey, and I'm responsible for running the business rates retention system within DLUC. So among other things, that in practice involves me looking after the sector-wide data collection forms that the NNDR forms that we require local authorities to fill in twice a year. We also set out core business rates retention figures through the annual local government finance settlement, and we also take steps to update the suite of legislation each year for policy updates and changes to give effect to those changes within the business rates retention system. So as Adrian said, again, I'm here to talk to you about the consultation that we're running, which proposes some technical amendments to the way that we plan to run the business rates retention system. And that I'm hoping that by talking to you about these changes today and the consultation, it will help increase the understanding across the sector with regards to the technical changes we think we need to introduce. This is particularly important, I think, to talk about, given if we proceed with these changes, it will have quite big knock-on consequences for how the business rates retention system looks and feels for you all from next year. Primarily, that will be within the local government finance settlement and in the upcoming NNDR forms. So I think we've moved on to slide 1, which is great. So it's probably helpful if I set out a bit of detail on what's driving the case for change in terms of why we need to make some changes to the rates retention system. So the first thing to flag is that we think the proposed changes are essential following measures included in the non-domestic rating bill, which brings forward changes to how business rates multipliers are calculated and applied. So that's kind of happening in the tax separately, but it has knock-on consequences for how we run the rates retention system. So the reason the changes are essential is to ensure that we continue to make accurate calculations using the data that you provide us under the business rates retention system. So in practice, that relates to the levy and safety net mechanisms that are built into the system, which use kind of baseline funding levels and business rate baselines to calculate levy rates and safety net thresholds. Those figures are obviously indexed within the local government finance report each year. So we need to make sure we continue to index those accurately. We currently use a small multiplier. We'll have to revisit that given the changes that the bill presents. And we also need to rethink how we compensate local authorities for any future under indexation of business rates multipliers. So if or when business rates multipliers are frozen, local government currently gets a compensation for the fact that the business rates that you collect and retain would otherwise have increased if that decision wasn't made. We currently use the small multiplier to calculate what that compensation should be, combining applying a kind of under indexation factor with your business rates income that you state on your NNDR forms, but we'll have to rethink that and won't be able to just focus on the small multiplier independently anymore. So as I mentioned earlier, we're planning to introduce these changes to align with the introduction of the bill powers, and doing that will ensure that we keep the business rates retention system as being capable of making accurate calculations, noting that the tax policy landscape has changed kind of beneath us. So if we could move on to the next slide, Adrian, that'd be great. Thank you. So I thought it'd be helpful to go into a bit more detail on what specifically is changing. I should stress all of this information is also in the live consultation document, which I can say a bit more about at the end. But what's specifically changing with business rates multipliers and kind of the specific amendments that we think we need to make in response to that. So on the left hand side you've got the bill changes to multipliers, and on the right hand side is kind of the proposals that are in the consultation document on what we think we need to change to rates retention. So firstly, as set out on the left hand side, the bill proposes two main changes to business rates multipliers. So firstly, the default link in business rates multipliers will be CPI rather than RPI. Now I've included that in the slide, but hopefully that's fairly familiar across the sector, given in substance this change is already in effect, and local government should be familiar with that from the 23-24 settlement. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly in terms of the discussion we're having today, and the focus of the consultation, the small and supplementary multipliers that currently exist will effectively be decoupled, and will be independent of one another. So the supplement will no longer exist in its current form, and in place there will be an independent standard multiplier. And given the multipliers will be independent, they will be treated separately. So as a consequence of this, and just moving across onto the right hand side of the slide, which I think the slides have just gone down, Adrian. I'm not sure if that was planned.
I wonder if we've just lost Adrian actually, because
that is a good point.
He's gone off the screen.
That's a good point, Lindsay.
Yeah.
I'm back. I'm back.
Oh,
sorry, just for some reason Teams just booted me out. Thanks.
We were without a host, Adrian.
Yeah. Can you? Are you still on that same slide, Jeffrey?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think the slides are showing anymore, Adrian. Is that all right if you reshare them? Sorry.
I will do. Yeah.
Or I can share them if that's helpful.
There we are.
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah. So where was I? So looking across to the right hand side of the slide, so we know what's changing in the tax policy space. So what do we think we need to change in terms of the business rates retention system? Well, as a consequence of the tax changes, we think we need to make amendments to the way we run the BRR system, as I've mentioned. So primarily this is because the way we set the system up and run it currently, we utilize the small multiplier quite a lot. So the small multiplier currently is used to uprate BFLs and top-ups and tariffs in the annual local government finance settlement. And it's also the under indexation of the small multiplier that we use to calculate a factor which is applied to your retained income to compensate local authorities for any freezes or under indexation of business rates multipliers when the Chancellor announces such decisions. So what do those kind of proposed changes mean for you? Well, firstly, it would mean that the methodology set out to calculate baseline funding levels and top-ups and tariffs in the settlement, specifically through the LGFR, would be revised to recognise the independent treatment of both the small and the standard multiplier. So at the moment, if you look at the LGFR from 23-24, you'll see that the indexation is kind of calculated by taking a BFL and then applying the change in the small multiplier. But obviously we will have to do something more nuanced of factoring both the change in both multipliers going forwards. Secondly, NNDR forms would need to change to collect more granular data from local authorities on items such as gross rates payable, transitional arrangements, reliefs, both mandatory and discretionary, and accounting adjustments. So all of which would need to be broken down to show the income from hereditaments subject to each of the small and standard multipliers separately. So at the moment, I would describe the NNDR form as kind of you report everything on an aggregated basis on well, I was going to say one column, but obviously there's DA splits, isn't there? But in future, it will be necessary to kind of have two different sets of columns collecting the income, the data from you on the small multiplier and also on the standard multiplier. So that granular data would then have a more nuanced under indexation calculation applied to it based on two separate factors. So we'll calculate one under indexation factor for the small multiplier and another one for the standard multiplier. And I appreciate that probably feels quite abstract in terms of my references of how the NNDR form will look, but we've tried to give an indication of how the NNDR form will look going forwards with a visual illustration within the consultation document, and we also attached a mock-up NNDR form alongside the consultation web link, so you can access that via Excel to see a very early kind of version of what the form might look like in structure. I should stress that it's not the final NNDR form to complete by any means, and we'll circulate that as we usually do at the relevant time. So if we could just move on to the last slide, Adrian. So I appreciate that's probably quite a lot of technical detail to absorb, and hopefully the points I've made have made sense, but they're most definitely better articulated through the consultation document, which is live at the moment on the .gov.uk website, and of which we'd welcome your engagement on. So we've set out our proposals and asked some specific questions in the consultation document, as is usual practice with consultations. So you can respond to the consultation, which is live until the 2nd of November, which I believe is just over a week to go. So it closes at the end of the 2nd, so just over a week. And details on how to respond are on the right-hand side of this slide. So you can either write a consultation response and send something back to that email address there, brrsa@levellingup.gov.uk, or you can send something in post via post. We've got an address to send to, but alternatively, you can also follow a link within the consultation document, which will take you to an online survey, and you can fill out responses to the questions there, including there's capacity for you to add comments, as well as just answering kind of a yes, no, do you agree, yes or no kind of format. So as well as that, as well as asking you to respond to the consultation document itself, I wanted to flag that it's definitely worth you considering what some of the practical impacts of these proposals would be on you and your authorities if you're not already doing so, particularly on the software your authority used to fill out NNDR forms. So for context, over the summer we've been reaching out to the major software suppliers to flag these proposed changes, so they'd have sufficient time to build in updates to the software systems to hopefully allow local authorities to fill out data in the new way going forwards. We've also kind of acknowledged within the consultation document that those changes that software suppliers are making remain ongoing. So it might be we might need to consider quite how we can collect data from people if, for example, there was a situation where someone wasn't able to fill out disaggregated data. So that kind of consideration is flagged in the consultation specifically as well. But yeah, so I hope that's been helpful. I think I'll probably leave it there by way of a presentation and talk. I look forward to going through all of your responses to the consultation, and then obviously you'll hear about the conclusion of the consultation before NNDR1 forms are launched later this year, and before the provisional settlement is published. Yeah, I'll hand back to Adrian, perhaps.
That's great, Jeffrey.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. I mean, I think given the time, we'll just open it to the floor and just see if you want to raise your hand if you've got a question that you want to raise now. Oh my God, I've got a couple as well, Jeff. If I can say them now rather than wait for later on. One of them was, I know a lot of councils are worried about their suppliers not being able to deliver the data or do that analysis that you need to split their business rates income between the two multipliers. I mean, are you confident, having spoken to the three main suppliers, that they can deliver? And if they can't, or if a council specifically can't, what's the fallback for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Adrian. And yeah, so we've been having discussions with all three of the main suppliers, and I think all of them now are working on updates. We've hopefully been able to provide them with as much information as possible to start working on the changes. But if for whatever reason the changes aren't implementable within local authority systems, the fallback option will kind of essentially there will be a yes/no function at the top of the NNDR form, we think, which will ask local authorities whether or not they can fill out data on a new basis or not. And if you click yes to that, then obviously you'll go through and complete the form in the new basis that we are asking for data to be filled out in. If you click no, the form will essentially look a lot like it does currently, but we will grey out the new columns, so you'll have to then fill in things on an old basis.
I bet that's fun to design that spreadsheet, isn't it?
yeah, it's taking some time, and we I should say that particular function isn't in the version that we published with the consultation document, because that's kind of something we've iterated over time. But yeah.
So I'm guessing that if an authority can't provide the data, and I guess even for the provisional settlement, you won't have it because you won't have had the NNDR1 forms. So I'm guessing there'll be some kind of proxy data that you'll be using. Is it possible to share that data? I'm guessing it's coming from the VOA, isn't it? About
that's it.
Can you share that now, or is that difficult to share?
That's a good question. So you'll see in the consultation that in terms of how we are planning to index BFLs and top-ups and tariffs, we're proposing to use an LA-based weighted average. So we're proposing in the consultation that we'll use the latest kind of like publicly available VOA list data to do that. So hopefully that should be what we'll be using at the point of doing it, is what would be readily available for a local authority to see how we had used it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I see. Because I guess this stuff will be you will need to put these changes through the provisional settlement, won't you? You'll need to see the two separate under indexation factors. And to produce a weighted under indexation factor for each authority, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that's it. So the under indexation factor will be built into the NNDR form when it's launched. But what we'll do in terms of the BFLs and the top-ups and tariffs, is like we say, we'll kind of, because we won't have collected the disaggregated data from local authorities yet, we're kind of proposing, and what we don't want to do is, it is in the consultation as a consideration, but what we're not minded to do is do a bespoke data collection from all local authorities to collect what that weighting might be when we think the focus should probably be on preparing, the sector should be preparing to provide us with data on the disaggregated basis when the NNDR form is launched. So as a result of that, we're proposing to do the settlement-based stuff via a proxy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And if you could share any of that would be handy, just so that authorities can kind of get a bit prepared about what those figures might look like, and just I suppose it's familiarising ourselves with what they would look like and what the splits might be. I know at the moment, I was literally about to say the word Cornwall, and Peter Hawkins put his hand up. Peter, do you want to ask the question?
Just to me, it just seems, this is quite late in the day. We're obviously all preparing our budgets next year for 24-25. We now know what the CPI rate is or the September CPI rate, and we can make assumptions around if the multiplier, as with the current system, if the multiplier was being frozen, we know what the sort of compensation cap figures could be. And it just seems, it's just very late in the day for 24-25, assumptions to be being made. So as Adrian says, the more we can get as early as possible, the better is my thoughts around that. I mean, because we have currently got our 100% pilot, even that compensation factor is a significant figure within our resources. I'm sure it is, with others as well.
Yeah.
But it's just another level of uncertainty at the moment, amongst much uncertainty with regards to our sort of budgeting and resourcing for next year.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that, Peter, and yeah, hopefully if the more we can share with you to help plan and build factor things into your budgets, I think sharing it at the earliest stage as is possible, I think the better, given these changes.
Yeah.
And the reason I was going to mention you, Peter, at Cornwall, I think that some of the data I'd seen was that Cornwall had the lowest share of business rate income from the standard, the higher multiplier. So
Yeah,
I mean, it puts you at one edge of the sort of the range, with people like Westminster or inner London and big city centres at the other end. So it's just, I think for authorities seeing where they are on that scale would be handy as well.
Yeah, and that's why hopefully this is also helpful to just quickly mention specific detail again in the consultation, but that's why we're proposing that kind of proxy is developed on an LA by LA basis to acknowledge kind of that different rate bases kind of exist across the country. So we're not applying an England only kind of proxy, but trying to develop it LA by LA.
Yeah, and I'm imagining that by the time you do the final settlement as well, you won't have seen, or you won't have had enough time to process the NNDR1. So the final settlement, I'd imagine, will be done on the basis of the proxies as well, would it, Jeffrey, rather than?
Yeah, it will be. And I should also say we're not planning on then using the NNDR data to then inform the what we do in the settlements each year. So I think what our proposal in the consultation at least is that we will use the proxy-based approach for the settlement, and then that weighting would be fixed for a number of years and perhaps then reviewed at a periodic within a periodic cycle, perhaps aligned with revaluation cycles, as the most appropriate moment to just reevaluate whether that proxy needs to change for the authority. Yeah.
Would you reevaluate the proxies once you've seen the NNDR ones, say for 25-26, or is that really just an extremist if the proxies just look well out of whack with what the actuals are?
Yeah, I think given the scale of change, we'll definitely check how the proxies look versus the NNDR data. But our initial proposal in the consultation is that we wouldn't deviate from the proxy-based approach for the settlement calculations. But obviously, in some ways, we need to keep the changes under review because we're doing something slightly unprecedented, and it'll take some time to get the data through to check how that looks.
Yeah, it's almost a live experiment, isn't it? Over the period of the settlement. It's not easy. I mean, then I know we're probably running a bit short of time, and I know you need to go at 1:30, don't you, Jeffrey? So I mean, if anyone has another question to ask, feel free to just put your hand up, and then we can deal with that. I've got one more actually, which was just the one thing I've struggled with kind of conceptually with the consultation that you've got is that that every authority would have a weighted index to sort of operate all their baselines. And that I can see how that works with on the business rates income side, on the business rate baseline side, that kind of makes sense. And then I think what you're saying is that same weighted index would be applied to the baseline funding level as well. So that the whole system kind of works on the basis of your indexation factor. What I didn't understand, and maybe this is something that's kind of just outside the scope of the settlement, also the consultation, is if everyone's got different indexation factors for their baseline funding level, how does that then fit into the wider settlement? Because at the moment, a lot of councils, they're effectively their settlement funding assessment is the same as their baseline funding level, and the two things could be there could be indexed on different bases for different councils. Is that something that we don't need to worry about, or is that something that's being captured in the settlement more widely?
Yeah, it's something that's being captured in the settlement more widely. So we are talking to my other colleagues that focus on the settlement more specifically from that point of view, to make sure that the changes are kind of docked in appropriately within the settlement. So and I know you flagged via email these points to it. So we are considering that internally as well. But in terms of for the purposes of making sure that the LGFR is kind of presented in the most accurate way, we think we need to index for BFLs and top-ups and tariffs in the way we've proposed in the consultation.
Yeah, I can see how that works in the system. It was just that, that makes sense. Lindsay Parkinson, did you have a quick question as well?
Hello.
Yeah.
But not necessarily such a question for Jeffrey, but it was just something from as an observation that I just thought I'd pass on to everybody, is that because I was aware of this through the technical consultation group, I made this an NDR change aware to my revenues manager only last week, and she was really surprised to hear about it. So I don't know, I'm surprised. I thought perhaps through the revenues, like IRRV groups, that revenues managers would have been aware of the NDR changes, but it was just mainly to pass on to other people on the call that if it may be worth having that conversation with their revenue managers about this. But also because they would suddenly get alarmed about the implications on their software, and I was able to say, and as Jeffrey said, I understand that there has been that communication already with the groups. But yeah, I think it's just something to pass on from my own experience.
That is really helpful to flag, Lindsay, and part of the reason I'm keen to come and do sessions like this, because I think the more we can talk about it, the more awareness of it we can raise. But on the revenue side, we've been, as well as talking to the software suppliers, we've been doing a lot of that engagement through the local authority representatives. So there's a few local authorities that act on behalf of the software suppliers, which I'm sure you already know. But so I'd encourage people to point their revenues colleagues in the direction of those LA reps, as well as the software suppliers themselves, because they've been a part of the discussions over the summer as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think another point to flag as well, Jeffrey, is that the accounting adjustments for bad debts and appeals would need to be split as well, wouldn't they? And that might be something that would fall into to be done by finance teams rather than revenues teams. So that could be something that's a finance issue rather than that's
it. And that's some of the feedback we got earlier in the summer was exactly to those points. But the reasons we need those bits split out particularly is because they obviously form part of the collectible rates line, which is then obviously used to apply the under indexation factors too. So yeah.
That's great. Well, thanks very much for that, Jeff. That's really, really, really helpful, really useful. I'm sure everyone's kind of taken all that on board, and we're just await to see. Well, I'm sure we'll try and get back to the consultation response, then just wait to see what comes out before the settlement and in the settlement itself. So that's great.
That'd be great. And thanks all for having me along to your webinar, and I'll speak to you soon.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Have good days.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay. Well, we'll press on with the next half hour, which is really looking at a funding update about what's going on with consumer price index, but the wider stuff that's going to affect our funding for 24-25 and beyond. So as I said, the CPI for September came out. We'll look at that, but we'll also look a little bit using the IFS's green budget to look ahead towards the autumn statement and some of the things that might then be in the provisional settlement in December. And finally, we'll look at the social care grants, which handily were confirmed by Nico Heslop in an email to authorities at the end of last week, which is, so we're starting to get most of the bits now of the settlement confirmed. Clearly, we don't know for certain exactly how everything will be handled, but I think we're starting to get to the point now where a lot of the elements within the settlement we're pretty clear about. Before we go into that, I just wanted to quickly, I had a few slides on the consultation that Jeffrey's just taken us through. It was just in case there were some things that we needed to raise and just mention that didn't come up in Jeffrey's presentation or in the questions afterwards. And it was just confirming with you where to find the consultation, that a lot of these changes have been caused by this new non-domestic rating bill, which is currently going through Parliament, which gives ministers the powers to decouple the two multipliers, which is what the consultation is all about, and also directing you to our briefing note that we issued on the 5th of October, which, if you haven't seen yet, is on the website and gives you some direction about how you might want to answer the questions. I won't go into much detail on that. You can look at the briefing note we've heard from Jeffrey already, but I just wanted to recap on some of the points that we thought were important on that consultation. The first is that yes, we do think it's important that the cap compensation factors are able to capture the actual impact of the decisions to decouple the multipliers on your income. We're assuming that the multipliers will diverge over time, and probably, I mean not certainly, but probably that the standard multiplier will be increased, possibly fully indexed every year, and the small business rate multiplier will be frozen. That's my guess about what ministers would try to do, or kind of work along that way. Then they can say, we've protected small businesses, but we've still managed to generate quite a good chunk of the business rate income that we want to support the public finances. We know there'll be differential consequences for individual authorities, so you'll have your own cap compensation fraction in essence, a weighted under indexation factor, which, I mean, we'll try and build that into the model as soon as we know how that will work and as soon as we've got enough data to do it. But at the moment, we don't know enough about how the system will work to be able to do that. So for now, our model still works on that single cap compensation fraction that's just based on the small business rate multiplier. I think the implication of what is being proposed in the consultation is that you will have you have cap compensation based on two fractions or two factors for 24-25, and each authority will have effectively its own weighted UIF under indexation factor. I think the issue might be, to start off with, that even if there's no divergence between the two multipliers in 24-25, I think there will still be an impact on your business rates cap compensation. And that's because I think Jeffrey kind of alluded to it in his presentation, which is that at the moment, everything's based on the small business rate multiplier. If you did a cap compensation based on the standard multiplier, it will give a slightly lower fraction. So it gives slightly lower compensation. So I think right from the outset, I think there will be a slight impact on the amount of cap compensation you get. The estimate is that we'll lose as a sector about £50 million. So it's not huge, but I think your share of that is probably determined roughly by partly by the share of your business rate income that comes from the standard multiplier. But I think really the main driver of your share of those losses will be your share of the national baseline funding level. The questions here about disaggregating the data and using proxies, I think Jeffrey really answered those very fully. And as Lindsay mentioned, I think the key thing is understanding how prepared your revenues teams are and how on top of it your software suppliers are. Are they going to deliver? Are they going to struggle? That would be the key thing, I think, for me. And then same thing here about having weighted average indices to index your business rate baseline and also to uplift the baseline funding level. That was an interesting response from Jeffrey about that each authority will have a different uplift in its baseline funding level to correspond with its weighted indexation factor, and that does then flow into the wider settlement. So if you're an authority that's got negative RSG, your entire settlement funding assessment is based on is based on your baseline funding level. You don't have any RSG, so that does actually then drive your actual funding. So it's important to make sure that's offset in some way through the settlement funding assessment and the wider settlement. As I mentioned to Jeffrey, I think it'd be great if we could have that data from the VOA about how the standard and small business rate multiplier splits across the country, so we can start to get some idea about what those multipliers and those cap compensation factors might look like. And then broadly over time, if the decoupling of the multipliers goes as we expected, and the standard multiplier is indexed and the small multiplier is frozen or something along those lines, I think that probably gives a slightly higher share of growth to those authorities that have got a higher share of the standard multiplier. So typically those bigger city centre in the London authorities will get a slightly, I think, higher level of growth than they would have done under the old system. So they're kind of just a quick recap on the responses that we've suggested about on the consultation, but get in touch with me if you want more information about how that might affect you. Then we move on to the September Consumer Price Index, which is now a really important factor in the settlement. It was announced last week. It remains static at 6.7%, so no change on August, and only slightly marginally lower than the July 23 figure of 6.8%. Find out more about it using that link. It was slightly higher than expected. Forecasters had expected a small reduction, 6.6%, but I think when you kind of dig into it and get more commentary about it, you realise that the raw CPI data only came within a whisker of the headline inflation index dropping to 6.6%. So it's pretty much in line with what forecasters had been expecting. Core inflation also continuing to drop as well from 6.2 to 6.1%, which is good news in terms of the government's fight against inflation. Part of the problem though is that inflation wages have continued to increase, and actually excluding bonuses increased by 7.8% in the quarter to the end of August. So that's pretty high, and I guess that's one factor that might start to worry the Bank of England. And I think for us as well in local government, those wage pressures might start to really bear on the inflation that you're managing within your own organisations as well, as they start to move their way through into public sector pay awards. Then, as we know, the September CPI is used to index the business rate multiplier. Our calculations show that the actual the index we think would be used for the multiplier is 6.62%, so slightly lower than the headline 6.7, and that's because the CPI that's actually reported by the ONS every month is based on the unrounded index levels that we don't actually see in the data. The published indices are rounded to one decimal place, and I think it's these rounded figures that are used to actually index the multiplier. So for that, you can see there in that second bullet point, the index in September 22 was 123.8. The index in September 23 was 123.0. So that gives us an increase of 6.62%. So that would, if everything was indexed in line with that September CPI, that would give us a small business rate multiplier of 53.2 pence, up from 49.9. If frozen, the cap compensation factor would be 123 over 499. So at the moment, our modelling just assumes that the small and the standard multiplier are increased at the same rate, which, as we know, that may not be the case for 24-25. I should say as well that we built those figures into our MTFP model now, so you can have a look at that and audit it if you wish. Then moving on to the Institute of Fiscal Studies Green Budget, which was published last week as well. It's always a really good advanced look at the autumn statement, which is due on the 22nd of November. They use economic forecasts from Citi, a bank who provide the economic forecasts, and they think that the UK economy will slip into recession in 2024. So that provides quite a depressing background, I think, to the Chancellor's autumn statement next month. That level of low growth makes it difficult for the Chancellor to stabilise debt and to meet his fiscal mandate that requires debt to be falling by 2028-29, i.e. usually the fifth year of the fiscal forecast. That's going to make it difficult for him to justify any tax cuts before the general election, but it also puts more pressure on spending decisions. So for us, thinking ahead to 2025-26, that makes it much less likely that we're going to have increases in funding above 0%, to be honest. The general election is due next year, with autumn being the most likely scenario. I think we can expect one more further budget in March 24, and possibly one more in the autumn in the later part of 2024. One possible pre-election autumn statement or spending review or something like that. So looking at the Green Budget and just pulling out a few of the key charts that from that publication. One is that Citi are now forecasting that CPI will be a little over 4% by the end of the year, which means that the Prime Minister has met his target of halving inflation within a year. And you can see there that in that chart, you can really see that after the September CPI, inflation really tumbles very quickly, and that's because the base effects fall out from September, October 2022. So it looks like the Prime Minister is going to meet at least one of his targets in advance of the election, that one about inflation. But the focus now is about how far price growth can fall back through 2024. In other words, whether it stays at around 4% or whether it starts to drop down to 2%, and whether it does so sustainably. So that's going to be important both for inflation within the economy and for us as organisations, but also what happens to interest rates as well. If it starts to fall back naturally to 2%, we may start to see interest rates fall back a little bit as well. Then look at the size of the public sector. This is something that we've been talking about, actually during the pandemic as well, which is that the state appears to be permanently larger than it was before the pandemic. So the effect of the pandemic, the original spending around the pandemic by the government, but also the effect that's had on things like spending on social care, spending on the NHS, etc., looks like it's going to permanently increase the level of spending within by the public sector. And you can see there that it looks like it's going to plateau at a much higher level than before the pandemic, and much higher even than it was as a percentage of GDP before the great financial crash in 2007-8. So for all those reasons, I think we're looking at a higher level of public spending as a percentage of national income. Increased levels of debt are clearly one part of that. We've got a lot more debt, nearly 100% of GDP now, and now with higher interest rates alongside that, we're looking at some really big. Part of that increase in spending is due to the fact that we're just now supporting much higher levels of interest payments on the UK debt. I think that those higher interest payments account for 1.2% of GDP. It's important, I think, just to note what the government's fiscal mandate is. In other words, what the fiscal rules that the Chancellor needs to make sure he's delivering as part of the autumn statement next month. As I mentioned already, the key one is that he needs to make sure that debt is falling on projections as a share of national income between the years 4 and 5 in the forecast period, which is 2028-29. At the moment, I think he's on course to do that. But the problem is, as the IFS say, pardon me, the government's true fiscal position is almost certainly weaker than the official forecasts suggest, and that's because the OBR is mandated to do its forecast based on stated government policy. So things like it has to assume that the government will increase fuel duty in line with stated policy, which everyone knows that it won't. So the government's fiscal policy is worse than the published position. Tax revenues have been better than expected. That's because of the impact of inflation on tax revenues. They're increasing more quickly in nominal terms than were expected. So that's good for the Treasury, not quite so good for spending departments or for local government, where our funding allocations are based in cash. So as inflation's gone up more quickly than we'd expected, our funding goes doesn't go as far. Borrowing's running slightly lower than expected as well, about 14% below forecasts. But the fact that interest rates are higher than expected means that, as the Chancellor said, he's warned of difficult decisions, partly because he's grappling with those interest rate payments being a lot higher than expected. He's saying debt payments now are around 20 to 30 billion pounds higher than they were in the forecasts. That's a huge change caused by the repricing of long-term debt. So putting all that together, if the Chancellor's going to meet his key rule about having debt falling in year 5, he's not got much room for manoeuvre. He's not got much room to cut tax or to increase spending. So I think we can expect quite a dour statement next month. I think the thing I always want to look at more than anything in these the Green Budget and these reviews of the autumn statement, etc., is what do those forecasters think about the spending increases or the spending totals, the spending change will be for unprotected budgets, and assuming that most of local government is an unprotected budget. Social care is probably a slightly different case these days, but certainly local government generally, I think we can classify as in this chart here on the right, and we're in the everything else pile. in a weak growth environment, stabilising debt is tricky. And I think what they're saying here is from the IFS is that beforehand they were thinking that there would be a real terms 1% in real terms increase in spending overall, but a 1% real terms cut for unprotected services. That seems to have worsened a little bit with these latest forecasts, with the IFS forecasting that unprotected departments would need to shoulder cuts of 1.5% per year in real terms, so slightly worse than we'd seen beforehand. The IFS say that their assumptions about protected department spending are quite conservative, but they also say that spending targets are what they call implausibly tight. So although we're looking at 1% real terms cuts in our funding based on these figures, I think what the IFS is saying is they don't think they're really going to be able to stick, and that a future government will have to find more money to come back and fund growth in spending for these departments, including local government. So that leaves us with quite a lot of uncertainty, but I mean, our view is that core grants, so SFA and other grants, will be frozen in cash terms. That's what we've got in our MTFP model as our default forecast, but really it could be plus or minus 2%. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty there about what will happen. I think one thing we can say for certain, though, is that our funding increases from 25-26 onwards will be less generous than they've been over the last 4 or 5 years. The final thing I just want to cover before the end of today, which is just looking at the social care grants. So Nico Heslop emailed authorities at the end of last week, 19th of October, just confirming what the social care grants will be for next year. Now, I think what he said was that he'd had quite a lot of questions from authorities asking him about just to confirm what the social care grants would be for next year. The key thing really is that most of those grants were pre-announced as part of the Autumn Statement 22, and the way that a lot of those grants were commuted from being funding for the social care reforms into funding for general support for social care functions. We knew what they were for 23-24, so we could track that, and we were fairly confident of what they would be for 24-25 as well. I think the issue was that the increases that were implied by the autumn statement figures were so big, certainly for the social care grant increases, that I think authorities were, not unreasonably a bit kind of wary about putting everything into their budgets. But fortunately, now we've had this email which confirms what will be in the settlement next year, and our figures were exactly the same as what was in Nico Heslop's email, with the exception of the social care grant in 24-25. So the figure for next year for the social care grant is 4.544 billion. Now, we had a slightly lower figure. We had 4.4464 billion. So we were 80 million pounds lower than were in Nico's figures. Now, looking through that, I think what the issue there might be is that if you recall back in 2023-24, an additional 80 million pounds was transferred into the social care grant to offset the cost of equalisation of the adult social care precept. Now, we had that obviously in the 23-24 figures, and we also had it in the base for 24-25 as well. What we weren't expecting was that there would be an extra 80 million pounds in the social care grant allocation for 24-25. Now, given that it's 80 million pounds, I'm just assuming here that it is another year's funding to offset the cost of the adult social care precept equalisation. I think that makes sense, and I can see that the logic for that in the policy statement back in December 22. What they said there is that the core grants for 24-25 would operate in the same way as they had in 23-24. What I had assumed was that just meant that the precept equalisation would continue in the same way. I didn't quite anticipate that there would be a second tranche of 80 million pounds to offset that cost. So I think what we can assume there is that the way that we've handled equalisation in the MTFP model is probably the way that it will be handled in the settlement. That looks increasingly likely now that 80 million quid is now available. I've also decided that in our modelling anyway, that we will top slice 80 million pounds from services grant to go into the social care grant. That's exactly what happened in 23-24. If you look back at the MTFP model, you can see how that figure was derived. And in the modelling, the latest version that I've just put on the website yesterday, that will do the same thing. So in effect, there's a further top slice of £80 million from the services grant to go into the social care grant. And all I'm doing there is matching the figure here that Nicola Heslop has given us for the social care grant and funding that £80 million tranche in the same way as it was back in 23-24. And any questions on that, just give me a call. And then finally, just letting you know about the webinars we've got in the next couple of months. We'll do one immediately after, well, shortly after the autumn statement at the end of next month. The statement comes out on the 22nd of November, and we'll do one, I think it's the following Tuesday, on the 28th of November. As soon as this webinar's over, I'll get the invites out for that, so you can get that into your diaries. And then we start to look at the forward to the provisional settlement. I'm assuming this will be pretty much the last day, or the second to last day before the recess. That's, I think it's the 18th, 19th of December. So I think we're looking again at a very late settlement. We'll do a webinar the following day at 2 o'clock. So we'll get our normal briefing notes out and analysis out on the day and the day after, and then we'll do a webinar at 2 p.m. the following afternoon, just to get that into your diaries, or just to aware of what that will be. I mean, I think given the fact that we've got a fairly late autumn statement, the department will need at least 2 weeks to respond to that and get a settlement out. I think as well that it's going to be a more complicated settlement for the department to handle, you know, with the decoupling of the multipliers, potentially with two multipliers going in different, you know, increasing at different rates. I think it's going to be a tricky one to handle. So that's what we're expecting. Of course, it could be the week before that, but our kind of like guess is that it'll be almost as late as possible. So there we are. That's my presentation finished. I think we're about a little bit early today, 5 to 11. So I'll open it to the floor now. If you have any questions, please come forward, and you know, any points to make or anything like that. That'd be good to hear what you've got to say. If you can't stay, thanks for coming along, and we'll see you soon. But otherwise, yeah, any comments would be great. I did see Martin there. I'm not sure if Martin can hear me. Also, Stuart, what do you think, Stuart Hogan? What do you think about the consultation on the business rate system and the technical changes there?
Oh,
hi, Stuart. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, I took a while to get off mute. Gosh, what would I say to all of that? I suppose I would observe that in any of these changes, there's a tension between the policy objectives that you want to achieve and the complexity that results from that. And experience over a long period shows that in that tension, the policy objectives usually win out, and the aim to minimise, or dare I say even reduce complexity, nearly always loses out. And I, you know, it looks as though that's what's happened here. Ministers perfectly reasonably would like a more flexible toolkit to tailor business rates burdens. And it's not just between larger businesses and smaller businesses. I think the powers are much more flexible than that, you know, between regions, between types of businesses. And as in other tax regimes, they would quite like to do something much more nuanced. And we may well see that in the autumn statement as a nice kind of pre-election package of giveaways to different sectors and different parts of the country and so forth. And so they want to do that, and you know, the burden on local authorities and dare I say even the department that results from that is inevitably kind of secondary. So the theme of the settlement, I think. it begins to emerge, which is that there won't be any new or breathtaking policy changes as part of the settlement. The main task will be handling the complexity that arises from tax changes. And that's at least on the policy side, that's not unexpected. It was queued up last year. Nico's email confirms all that. So we don't expect any surprises there. Money remains very tight, but trying to understand the effect on individual numbers on issues like core spending power and so forth is going to be very, very difficult. And of course, those are only administrative intermediaries. The key issue is that, as one of your colleagues mentioned earlier, is what's the effect on budgets and the planning for individual authorities, which I think is potentially going to be quite challenging.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think I'm worried about, and I'm sure authorities are as well, is just seeing those numbers for the first time in the provisional settlement, having not really, seen beforehand what that looks like, and what's the format of the numbers when you have, two under indexation factors. Everyone's got a different weighted blend of those two factors. It's going to be a big shock, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's another factor as well. Of course, the election is coming up. Ministers don't have a second year to do this; they've got to do it now, even if the election is as late as December next year. We're really on the countdown now, and so they want to do it straight away. And what that means is we'll be doing some kind of proxy mashup in the short term. And really, what you would do in any proper policy process is collect the data, share it with authorities, run the numbers, check that it's okay, and there just isn't time to do that. So we'll end up collecting the data but not being able to use it, using a proxy for the upcoming settlement, still having to do that for the final settlement because the data is still not ready in Q8, and then maybe the year after, whatever government is in charge might want to revisit the issue of proxies, or might want to just stay where they are. But that's all another world.
It's a long way down the line, isn't it? Yeah. But I hadn't kind of like appreciated what you said there, Stuart, that you could have different indexation, different increases and multipliers for different sectors, and I guess they could do things like if you're a high street business, you don't get the increase. If you're a big box warehouse, on the M6, then you get the full whack.
So I don't know the extent to which the VOA will have readily available data to inform the proxy based on the likely tax changes.
Yes.
They may, the proxy may be a much more by and large, or it may be more refined, based on the particular tax changes that are proposed. Or there may be none of this at all, of course. Maybe we will, as you say, just see something on the large multiplier and the small multiplier.
Yeah, but I mean, at the moment they're not even thinking about collecting the data about doing things by sectors or geography or anything. I mean, that would just multiply the level, the scope of data that needs to collect from authorities every twice a year.
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, who knows what that means? I don't know if the VOA has some data, then they might be able to make a better approximation to the tax yield in individual areas. And of course, if the proxy remains in place for the foreseeable future, then that may be the best you can do. Maybe in year 2 you collect more refined data, but this is all another government in the future. So.
Yeah, that's true. But Martin, you made a point there about the retail, leisure, and hospitality relief being scaled back now. Revaluations happened.
I think this just seemed to be rumours from certain other government departments speaking to sort of Central London business representative bodies, because clearly the retail sector saw generally a big reduction in business rates bills almost immediately the revaluation. We know, you know, there's rather extreme
Yeah.
examples, but you know, Harrods and Selfridges saw their bill fall 50%, and John Lewis and Oxford Street by 60% overnight. So obviously they're not benefiting much from the relief scheme, but might ministers be tempted to sort of somehow scale that back to release resources for other purposes, and what the implications might be? Because there may be, you know, industrial manufacturing premises that saw big increases that might now merit more help than them. And so that was just one thing. Whether there's any rumour to that, because obviously there's all these discussions that, and rumour and speculation that take place, so we'll have to wait and see. And I think just the point that Stuart's highlighted around, it just seems a bit difficult. The legislation has barely passed, it barely got royal assent. All of a sudden they're introducing, you know, differential multiplier, and it's not clear is the 51,000 RV thresholds going to remain in place, because to me it seems potentially quite a big cliff edge where you're at sort of 50,999 and you see your multiplier frozen. If you're 51,001, you're seeing a 7% increase in business rates, which to me perhaps they need to look at some sort of interaction with the small business rate multiplier. I accept that's going to add more complexity, but could they look at, you know, raising that threshold or having differential thresholds in different parts of the country, which they do, for example, for transitional relief, the small business property determination in London relative to the rest of the country. So there are already examples of, you know, how they have different thresholds in different parts of England, depending on, you know, the circumstances. But, you know, I suppose it's all speculation, and, you know, we'll just find out hopefully in the autumn statement on the 22nd.
Yeah, and I think Stuart's point there about the in the end policy wins out. You know, if the policy is there to go in a certain direction, then the technicalities just have to keep pace. And to be fair to the business rate retention team, I think they've always been very fair to try and make sure that authorities are fully compensated, that the scheme works properly. They don't tend to cut corners or do things improperly. They do a good job of it, which I think does have the side effect of making it complicated, but I think they do. They try and do the right thing and make it work properly. Has anyone else got a question or want to put something in the chat? I think it was quite a complicated pardon me, quite a complicated start off with Jeffrey today. You know, and we've got our briefing paper out there, and we'll try and do a bit more modelling around that when we get more data. I think at the moment, I think it's a bit tricky to do. I'm not quite sure how they're going to handle some of that stuff. So the more we can find out, the better. Any other questions? Anything? Any other points? I think we're kind of in that. Are we just in that holding mode at the moment until we find out more about the settlement? I think we might be. I think we could be. Okay, great. Well, if there aren't any more questions or points, no point prolonging it any longer. We'll call it a day. But of course, drop me a line if you've got any questions. Happy to answer them outside this webinar and go from there. But for now, thanks for coming along. Good to see you all, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Cheers. Bye now. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.